If you're new to oil painting, getting into this medium can be overwhelming, and with good reason. People have all kinds of rules they want you to pay attention to. Fat over lean, archival materials, paint safety, solvent safety, painting dark to light, thin to thick, and all kinds of guidelines about how to avoid making a muddy mess on your canvas. The information out there is so vast, and different artists can have completely opposite stances on how to get started in and ultimately master this medium, which makes matters even worse. So today I want to talk about the most common mistakes I see oil painters make. This video is designed with a beginner in mind, but these are mistakes I see being made pretty much up until the point that artists are selling their work full time. So if you're a beginner and you're facing information overload trying to learn how to paint in oil, I want this to be your one-stop shop for all of the habits that you'll want to be mindful of while you're painting. And if you've been painting for a while, I think this checklist can be a helpful reminder of habits that perhaps you've lost sight of, or offer an insight into mistakes that might be holding you back. So let's jump into it. And while you're watching, if you find one of these points helpful, make sure to let me know in the comments and give this video a like. And make sure to watch to the end as well to hear the biggest mistake that I see holding painters back at all levels. All right, let's kick this off. The number one mistake I see beginner oil painters make over and over again is blending on the canvas. Perhaps you put a color down on your canvas and it isn't quite right. Then you tried again and overcorrected. So what do? You mix them together, of course. Yes, this makes total sense. If you average out the colors that you're trying to mix, you should theoretically arrive closer to your goal color mixture. Except oftentimes what happens is that best case scenario, the buildup of paint has become too thick and too muddy. Worst case scenario, all of your paint mixtures were off and now you have a muddy section of a painting that's also not the color you were aiming for. So if this is you, I find it's helpful to remind yourself to slow down and check your paint mixtures. I think Mark Carter's suggestion of using a color checker is great, and you can do this on your brush too without needing a separate gadget. Simply mix up the paint until you think it's correct, hold your loaded paintbrush up to your reference, and see if the color matches. If it doesn't, all you need to do is ask, is the value too light or dark? Is the hue off? Or is the chroma too high or too low? And with these questions in mind, you should be appropriately armed to go back and correct that color. Now, with this technique, it's important to note that this works provided that the light on your brush or your color picker and your reference are the same. If you're painting from life and you're close to your subject, this should work easily as the light on you and your subject is probably automatically the same. But if you're painting from a photo on a screen, for instance, that screen will cast a shadow on your brush and it'll make it really hard to check that color. So in this situation, I would probably suggest an alternative. One exercise a student suggested to me that I absolutely love is that you print out your reference and you put it in a plastic sleeve, the kind that you would insert into a 3-ring binder. Then you can mix up paint and put it directly onto that plastic sleeve over top of the corresponding area of your reference. And you should know right away whether you've hit your mark and mixed up the right color. The more you do this exercise to train your brain and get comfortable with color mixing, the more you can lay your paint down once, trust that it's correct, and avoid overworking your paintings and creating mud. Which leads me to mistake number 2. This next mistake, I think, goes hand in hand with the first one, and that is to assume that more rendering, blending, or shading equals more realism. Having control over your rendering can absolutely help you achieve a high level of realism, but oftentimes really aesthetic paintings are built off of a very flat value structure with no gradients or shading or rendering at all. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, go take a look at classical techniques for bark drawing or cast drawing. The block-ins for these pieces often come down to two entirely flat values, a dark and a light. But the pieces look incredibly convincing, even without having any kind of gradients or shading in there. This is because they have control of their basic value pattern. When you get really excited about the blending or the shading, often this simple value pattern can get lost, and the painting or drawing may feel convincing in some ways, but that rendering often covers up an underlying problem. So remember, when we think of an artist like Sargent or Schmid, we mostly marvel at how much they conveyed with so few brushstrokes. So don't worry about blending with 1,000 marks when just one good mark with the right paint mixture will do. The third mistake that I see painters making is another habit that can contribute to the previous mistake, which is using brushes that are too small. When you use brushes that are too small, you have to make 10 strokes where one would do, which encourages those overwrought paintings that we keep talking about in this video. So instead, here's a rule of thumb for learning to wield bigger brushes that make more efficient brush strokes more confidently. You want to choose the biggest brush that you could possibly cover your target area with. I don't mean like an entire quarter of the canvas. When I say target area, I mean whatever shape you are trying to lay down in paint in that particular moment. And once you've identified the largest brush for the job, go one size bigger. I know that seems mean, but it will get you so confident in your brush really quickly. All right, the fourth mistake is not putting enough paint on your palette, not mixing enough paint, and not loading enough paint onto your brush. So I get it. No one wants to waste these beautiful tubes of paint that you've just invested all this money in, especially when you're a beginner and you're just getting started and you probably went to the art supply store and did a gigantic haul. But here's the thing. When you put out tiny daubs of paint to minimize waste, you mix up tiny piles of paint on your palette, and then put way too little paint on your brush, which in turn encourages you to have an extremely heavy hand. Let me explain. When you have enough paint on your brush, it will glide off of your brush and onto the canvas effortlessly. It also lets you paint wet on wet without making mud, because those strokes of paint can glide gently over top of one another instead of having to get mashed and mixed together. But when you have too little, the only way to extract enough paint from your brush onto the canvas is to press down really hard, which is a habit that can lead to messy, overwrought paintings instead of loose, expressive brushwork. Which leads me to the fifth beginner oil painting mistake, having a muddy work surface. If you're pulling paint from dirty paint piles, mixing with dirty brushes, or mixing on a palette that's already covered with paint, chances are your colors are going to look really dull really fast. So try to scrape your palette clean as soon as it starts to fill up. Change your brushes or pull the paint out of them with a paper towel when they're looking dirty, and be mindful of contaminating your paint piles. All right, so we've talked about some common material mistakes. Now I want to change gears and talk about your materials. And specifically for this sixth mistake, I want to talk about tailoring your materials to your goals. So this sixth common mistake I see is artists who are using not bad materials per se, but materials that don't align with the way that they want to work. For instance, maybe you want to work alla prima and be able to wipe all the way back down to the white of the canvas if desired. In that case, you absolutely don't want a canvas that is too absorbent, because it'll stain easily and you can't get back to white no matter how hard you try. Or perhaps you want to create certain colors in your work, but you have a palette that just cannot accomplish that goal. This can be a tricky mistake to correct, which is why it's helpful to have a mentor or coach or instructor who understands your goals and can help you identify the right tools for your goal style. because this is a place where I think painters can really spin their wheels for quite a long time. And if you'd like that mentor to be me, I'll include a link in the description that you can check out to see if we're a great fit to work together. Okay, the 7th beginner mistake I see oil painters make is buying way too many colors of paint. If you could set up your own display rack for Winsor & Newton with all of the colors you have, I can only imagine the overwhelm you must feel when laying your palette out and mixing color. So when starting out, I like my palette to be anywhere from 4 to 12 colors. And I say this about starting out, but honestly, this is what I do now. I have a couple of specialty colors that I might throw in on top of these, but 4 to 12 colors is what gets me through pretty much every painting you've seen me make on this YouTube channel. So if I'm using just 4 colors, I might have a primary palette of cadmium lemon, permanent rose, ultramarine blue, plus titanium white. If I have an 8-color palette, that probably is my basic earth tone palette, which I use for a lot of portraiture and wildlife pieces, which includes the transparent oxides, terra rosa, yellow ochre pale, and viridian, on top of ultramarine blue and titanium white from the previous palette. And if I'm up to 12 colors, that's probably a full palette, including cad lemon, cad yellow, cad orange, and cad red. I know that was a lot to go through, so I do have a link in the description to download my palette and see exactly what I use. But I want to note that I don't have to have 7 different kinds of green, or indigo, or 5 different blacks to mix a robust range of color. And when you have that many colors, the overwhelm is real. When in doubt, find out what your favorite artists use and try those colors out for a while, and perhaps stay away from the oil paint aisle until the temptation fades and you feel really confident with the palette that you have. All right, mistake number 8, not backing up often enough. If your paintings look overly detailed, overly tight, or they don't hold together at a distance the way you want, chances are you aren't backing up from your easel often enough. I know some artists tape a reminder to back up on their easels, but before this, make sure you have a room that lets you comfortably back up easily and often. Don't set up your studio so that you have to bob and weave between obstacles to get 10 feet back from your easel. And how do you know if this is you, if you're not doing this often enough? Well, if you have to ask, you probably aren't backing up often enough. I know that I don't back up often enough. In a perfect world, we would all paint standing, because when we stand, it's really natural to be back and forth, and we would probably make all of our decisions from about 10 feet back, and we would just walk up to the easel only to lay down our marks after that decision has been made. And that has to be the biggest secret I can think of to achieving looser brushwork and more expressive paintings. All right, now we get into the good stuff. Mistake number 9 is waiting to start until everything is perfect. And this can take a number of forms. Sometimes it looks like someone who doesn't want to make a painting unless everything is 100% archival. Or not wanting to paint until you're a master of drawing, or never diving into color until you know everything there is to know about value. And don't get me wrong, there is some merit to this, but some painters go overboard, and their fear of being anything less than perfect keeps them from just trying something out and having fun. And at the end of the day, this is painting. We need to be having fun. All right, and finally, my number 1 mistake, number 10 on this list, is expecting linear progress out of your work and wanting every painting to exceed the previous one. This is a tough one, especially when we start seeing improvement in our work. We expect that if we're working hard enough, we should just be able to power through and improve every time we sit down to paint. But learning isn't like that. It goes in waves, and sometimes you just won't be on your game. Or maybe you'll be grappling with how to integrate several techniques at once, and the result will be a mess, even though you mastered all of those techniques individually. Or maybe you just had a fantastically successful painting, but you don't quite know why it was so successful, and so you don't know how to replicate that success, and you're rolling the dice with that next painting. Whatever the reason, this is normal, and it's important to give ourselves grace and look at the overall trends as much as we can, instead of getting bogged down in trying to always make sure that progress is linear. If you want my help setting appropriate goals and tracking your growth as a painter, make sure to check out the coaching link in the description. I would love to hear from you. And if you would like to take this piece that I used for this painting time-lapse home, or you'd like to see other pieces I have available, I've included a link to my website in the description as well. As always, if you found this video helpful or it was just what you needed to hear today, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new videos. Until next time, happy painting.